In room 214 at St. Mary's Hospital, the early morning silence seemed heavier than air. The peeling walls, yellowed with age, held the kind of stillness that brings not rest, but expectation. The patient, a 62-year-old man in recovery, slept with slow breathing, his body sunk into a worn mattress. It was then that something imperceptible at first made his skin crawl. The sheet began to sag, first millimeters, then centimeters, as if an invisible weight had settled beside him. There were no footsteps, no creaking of the bed, only the muffled sound of the fabric stretching. He opened his eyes slowly, his heart racing, unable to understand why. When he turned his head, there was no one there, no figure, no shadow cast by the dim hallway light. But the mark on the sheet was there, deep, clear, as if a body had sat down, bending the fabric and letting the mattress sag. His breath caught, and the feeling of not being alone became suffocating, as if something were still there. Watching, he tried to convince himself he was dreaming, but the air in the room seemed colder, heavier, and the silence wasn't silence. It was a muffled, distant sound, like breathing under the sheets. Hesitantly, he reached out, touching the dip in the mattress. The fabric was warm, as if someone had actually been there seconds before. A shiver ran down his spine, and as he drew his hand back, he felt the sheet tug slightly, as if invisible fingers were holding the corner. The heart monitor beeped, rapidly, irregularly. In the dim light, he noticed a subtle movement near the foot of the bed, the slight shifting of the sheet, forming a new fold that crept toward him. The sound of breathing grew closer, clearer, until he felt a light weight on his legs, followed by a damp chill that seeped through the fabric. That was when, inches from his ear, he heard a low, almost childlike whisper saying his name. He sat up with a start, and the sheet fell away completely, but the imprint of a body was still there. This video reconstructs, based on medical records, testimonies, and security records, a series of events that occurred over 6 weeks at St. Mary's Hospital, a century-old building in a small town in rural Ohio, where narrow corridors and peeling paint create a setting that seems designed for the echo of the early morning. It's not a police investigation, though there are reports and protocols, and it's also not just a report of a haunting, though it involves everything we call impossible when language fails us. What you'll see is a coherent sequence of occurrences with an unmistakable pattern. Always after 2:40 a.m., always in rooms on the second floor, always with a sudden change in temperature, a drop in ambient noise, and the same invisible gesture of presence. The sheet slowly gives way, the mattress sinks as if a body were settling next to someone sleeping, and then a clear mark remains, curved and sharp, even when no one is there. The hospital staff is not made up of naive believers. They are professionals trained in routines, protocols, and responsibilities, and that is precisely why what follows deserves careful observation. Nurses who refuse to cross a hallway alone, cameras that record the perfect stillness of a void, while, in the next room, a patient swears he feels weight on his legs, respirators that oscillate for milliseconds, monitors that go off without mechanical cause, and a succession of testimonies that converge on the same sensation, described in different ways. Someone is here, nearby, sitting, curious and sad like a child learning to imitate an adult's breathing. From the first documented case, what seemed like an isolated incident repeats itself with small variations, as if a pattern were trying to perfect itself, approaching night after night direct contact. And what we began by calling noise, fatigue, or coincidence gains density until the word fear ceases to be an exaggeration and becomes the only honest way to name what happens when the fabric gives way and the air becomes thin. The patient in room 214, Harold Whitman, 62, hypertensive, admitted for observation after an episode of chest pain, was a man of methodical habits, a newspaper reader, a skeptic by temperament and constitution. His medical record describes light sleep, polite laughter, little conversation. The early morning of March 12th to 13th begins normally. Blood pressure stabilized, medication up to date, light from the hallway leaking. Through the cracks in the door, that pale beam that outlines the shadow of the grate on the floor. At 3:07 a.m., the temperature reading indicates a drop of 1.6 degs in the room, a small variation, which might have gone unnoticed had subsequent maintenance not confirmed that the thermostat was intact. Harold wakes for no clear reason and notices the smell first, a damp chill, like laundry that didn't dry properly, old basement dampness. The next second, he feels the fabric touch his leg with real weight at first light, then a firm, stepped settling, exactly as when a person rests their hand on it before sitting next to you. He turns his face and sees no one, but the mark on the sheet is there. A deep circle at hip height, two folds converging to a point, and if there's one thing ancient fears have taught us, it's that the body recognizes presence before reason. So the heart races, the monitor chirps, the bell lights. Nurse Amanda rushes in and finds Harold half-raised, eyes wide, his hand still outstretched as if he'd touched something warm. Protocol calls for calm, repositioning, assessment, but the word that escapes his mouth isn't technical. Someone. Later, when trying to explain, he'll say the sensation was childish, like when a child climbs into their father's bed and tries not to wake him. Amanda adjusts the sheet and sees, for 2 full seconds, the mark still there, even without weight on the fabric, as if the fabric took a while to unlearn how to sink. The silence demands an explanation. Reason offers hypotheses, uneven mattress inflation, air circulation, visual cue, and the index case becomes a nursing note stamped with curiosity. But at 3:12 a.m., a low breathing sound seems to come from the foot of the bed. Harold swears he hears his name said the way his granddaughter says it, dragging out the R, and at that moment, fear ceases to be a concept and becomes a concrete thing, the size of an empty space that insists on taking up space. And that's how 2:14 begins a sequence that doesn't end there, because in the hallway the light flashes once, and in the security room, when the cameras rewind, everything is still, perfectly still, as if presence only existed inside human breathing. Amanda Ray, 29, with an exemplary education, 2 daughters, a grueling schedule between shifts and a specialization course, is the kind of professional the wee hours respect. Her routine includes rhythmic checks, note-taking in firm handwriting, and the discipline to not dramatize what tires her, but what the early morning of March 13th throws her way, isn't in the manual. After calming Harold, Amanda records unexplained sinking in the mattress, subjective sensation of close breathing, patient anxiety, and decides, against the comfort of habit, to return to the room with the portable airflow monitor, a strange piece of equipment borrowed from a study evaluating heat exchange in closed environments. She positions the sensor at bed level and observes minimal fluctuations that could mean nothing, until, within 5 seconds, the graph shows a downward pressure curve, as if something were occupying the space that previously belonged to the void. Amanda holds her breath, knowing that breathing itself alters the reading, and it is then that the sheet gives way again, very slightly, but enough for a trained eye to notice. She steps back, her heart racing, and commits the silent heresy of speaking to nothing. If there's anyone here, I can see them. At the same instant, the sensor returns to baseline as if the presence were receding, and Amanda does what professionals do when the unknown crosses the night. She searches for a witness. She calls Louise, a veteran technician. She calls Ezra, a clinical resident. She calls Ortiz, the night security guard, and asks them to look, to feel, to wait. Nothing happens for a full minute, and skepticism sets in like a nervous joke until the mattress sinks again with the delicacy of someone learning. Etiquette. First the touch, then the settling. Louise bites her lip. Ortiz holds the edge of the door. Ezra searches for a reason in the teeth of a power switch. No one finds the child the gesture suggests, but everyone sees the mark left. Protocol requires them to report to the coordinator, and they do, but they also ask, without writing, that the night pass quickly. That same night, Amanda has the first impression that what is sinking is trying to synchronize a rhythm. Her breathing quickens, and for 2 cycles, the sinking seems to accompany her, as if the invisible wanted to learn to be on this side. But before continuing the story, check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because there is a new video here every day. At the security checkpoint, 4 screens divide the early morning into quadrants of monotony: empty hallway, fire escape, motionless elevator, service door. Ortiz rewinds the recordings to between 3:10 and 3:20, and what one sees is the purity of nothingness, silence in the form of stable pixels. The camera at 2:14 shows only the rectangle of the door and the outline of the floor. No movement, no visitors, no shadows crossing the beam of light. Nothing, Ortiz repeats, but it's when Amanda asks to change the angle and focus on the small window at 2:14, that privacy visor, somewhat opaque, that sometimes reflects reflections, that the early morning takes a back seat. On the glass, in a specific frame, a tiny vibration appears, not as a E figure, but as a memory of a figure, a blur sensitive to the already suspicious eye. Ortiz freezes, zooms in, loses definition. The image confesses nothing, but the discomfort lingers as background noise. In the early hours of the morning, small clues grow, and thus the attempt to synchronize real time with the recording is born. Amanda holds the radio. Ortiz keeps track of the seconds. Louise stays in the hallway. When Amanda enters 2:14 again, her eyes and the window seem to converse. The instant the sheet gives way, the glass gives off a brief glow, a reflection of nothing. When the sinking ceases, the glow disappears. Again, no one appears in the footage, and again the window returns a timid clue that doesn't translate into proof. The hospital doesn't have the budget for superstition, but it also can't ignore a sequence that repeats itself, so the coordinators authorize a night of extended observation. What they don't know is that this authorization functions as an invitation, and the phenomenon, as if understanding the language of gestures, responds by coming a little closer. The cross-recordings construct a pattern that seems choreographed. At 2:47 a.m., there is the first thermal change, a small drop in temperature, and that faint smell of old damp. At 3:12 a.m., the first perceptible sinking occurs, like a brief, almost experimental sitting. At 3:33 a.m. comes the second, less timid movement, with the sheet moving toward the chest, as if the invisible wanted to get closer to the sound of the heart. At 2:14, this repeats itself for 3 early mornings. Then a room change for medical logistics pushes the phenomenon to 212, where a patient recovering from surgery reports something identical. It felt like the weight of a well-behaved child, the kind that asks if they can climb into bed. The word child begins to circulate in the testimonies, not out of hysteria, but because the gesture is delicate, with a curious rhythm, and because in the second week, someone finds in the archive a folder with the name of a girl who died there in 1952, rheumatic fever, 9 years old, second-floor rooms, and although this proves nothing, the coincidence works as an emotional lens. Every time the sheet gives way, they turn their faces expecting not a monster, but a small, invisible body trying to learn to share a space. The times remain like steps, and on the third step, 3:33. The heart monitor reacts as if the room were breathing along. Amanda, who until then had negotiated fear using science, notes what she doesn't know how to measure. The pattern seems to want contact. St. Mary's opened in 1924, driven by donations from Catholic families and the practical need for beds within a 50-mile radius. The wing where the phenomenon occurs was once a pediatric ward before becoming general practice corridors, and the memory of the place is made up of layers of paint and lost names. In the city's newspaper library, yellowed newspapers tell of a particularly cruel winter in 1952, fevers, coughs, and a girl named Ruth Ellison, hospitalized for 3 months, who liked to draw circles on the sheets with her finger while her mother slept in the viscose chair. Ruth's file records restless dreams at 3 a.m. and a phrase spoken to the head nurse, "Can I climb into your bed just a little?" A phrase noted as febrile delirium. When Amanda reads this, the present dawn seems to find a sister in the ancient dawn. Maintenance technicians ensure that no pipes run beneath the rooms involved, that there is no vibration to justify the sinking, that the insulation is sufficient to prevent micro-air currents. What remains? The fabric, the body, and the space between them, and it is precisely this space that the story seems to desire. When, at the end of the second week, a patient in 210 wakes up crying because she felt a tiny hand grasp her wrist, Amanda holds her hand and reflexively feels the gesture, a light pressure from tiny fingers that aren't there. The hospital decides to close the floor for a night to fully test the system, but by then, presence has learned to follow people. That same night, in the on-call dormitory, the sheet on the bed where Amanda tries to sleep gives way 3 times, delicate and insistent, and the damp chill around the pillow carries a smell of school chalk. Have you ever witnessed a supernatural event? Tell us your story in the comments. When routine becomes a cycle of watching and waiting, the mind begins to look for openings to act. Amanda, Louise, Ezra, and even Ortiz, the security guard, were already more involved than they admitted. Among them, ideas gleaned from obscure online forums, excerpts from books on particle physics, and even reports of ghost hunters using simple techniques to detect invisible shifts in the environment circulated. It was Ezra who suggested the salt test, not out of mystical belief, but out of logic. A thin line of salt on the floor around the bed would act as a physical marker. If something moved there, it would leave a visible change. Ortiz contributed floor noise recorders, originally used to detect vibrations in plumbing systems. Amanda provided an ultrafine mist spray, the kind used in respiratory therapy, to reveal subtle movements in the air. Early Friday morning, shortly after 2:50 a.m., they set the scene. Room 214 was empty, the curtains drawn, and the lighting dimmed to a portable lamp, which cast a yellowish circle on the floor. The salt was scattered precisely, forming an imperfect ring. The recorder, positioned on the windowsill, blinked slowly, ready to capture any sound. And then they waited. At 3:12 a.m., the salt shifted, not as if someone had dragged their foot, but as if a specific spot had given way, collapsing inward. Instantly, the sheet sank. The recorder picked up a low, irregular sound, a sigh, or perhaps the beginnings of controlled breathing. Amanda instinctively spoke the name she'd found on the old files. Ruth. The sinking stopped for 2 seconds. The room fell into a thick silence, and then the weight returned, this time with a different gesture. Instead of sitting up, the presence seemed to rest its head on the pillow. Amanda swallowed, leaned closer and said, "It's okay. You can stay for a little while." The recorder picked up a barely audible sound, 2 tiny beats like a stifled sob. Louise pressed her fingers against the bedrail. Ortiz took a half-step away from the door, but didn't leave. Ezra, his voice breaking, murmured, "It seems she understood." The presence remained motionless for over 30 seconds. Then, slowly, the weight disappeared until the sheet returned to its original shape. When they turned on the lights, the salt showed a small break in the line, exactly at the level of the sinking. It was the first time they had clear, albeit minimal, physical evidence. The phenomenon had until then seemed curious, almost delicate. But in the early hours of March 19th, something changed. The patient in room 212, a 54-year-old woman recovering from abdominal surgery, woke up with the sensation of someone sitting next to her. Her instinct was to react. She stood up abruptly, trying to move away from the weight. What happened next put Amanda on high alert. The sinking didn't recede. Instead, it slid up the patient's legs, as if the presence were trying to hold its position. The movement pulled at the sheet, and with it, the connected tube. The pain made the patient scream. Amanda, who was in the hallway, rushed in. She saw the sheet forming for the first time, a high curve resembling the shape of a supported knee. "Don't do that," she said instinctively, in a firm voice, like someone scolding a child. The air in the room seemed to thicken. The monitor registered a sudden drop in the ambient noise level, and the temperature dropped 2 degrees in a matter of seconds. The lamps trembled as if an invisible breath passed through them. For 30 seconds, the sheet stirred without pattern, not a sitting or lying motion, but a series of rapid pressures, almost as if small hands were beating against the fabric, agitated or confused. Amanda remained calm, holding the sheet and repeating in a low tone, "It hurts. Stop. It hurts." Gradually, the movement ceased. The weight disappeared all at once, as if it had been pulled out of the mattress. The silence that remained was different, not empty, but charged with absence, as if something had left, against its will. That night, management decided to relocate patients from that corridor. The beds were left empty. But shortly after 3:12 a.m., room 208, completely unoccupied, showed a clear dip in the sheet, captured by internal cameras. Ortiz, observing from the security post, commented, "It's a rehearsal. She's training." It was the first time anyone had referred to the phenomenon as she, without hesitation. The move to the 3rd floor, room 312, happened more by chance than strategic decision. The 2nd floor needed repairs to the air conditioning system, and the entire wing was evacuated. But for Amanda, who was already beginning to understand the phenomenon as something that followed her more than just confined to one room, a change of scenery brought no relief. 312 had a different smell, not exactly unpleasant, but rather old. The window had a thick glass visor with a worn, translucent film that let in light from the hallway but returned diffuse reflections. This film, installed decades earlier, had small ripples invisible to the touch, but which distorted images as if they were moving water. On the first night, Amanda went in for the 3:10 a.m. checkup. Everything was normal. The heart monitor was within normal limits. The patient was asleep, breathing lightly. But when the digital clock struck 3:12 a.m., the sheet gave way, just as before. And this time she noticed that, simultaneously, the window glass produced an almost organic glow, as if it had been shivered. It was a reflection that came not from outside, but from within the material, spreading quickly and disappearing in an instant. Amanda approached, trying to understand its source, but the glass only returned her shadow, broken into lines and spots. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated itself. 3:12 a.m., sinking, reflection, damp chill in the air. Most unsettling was when, on the 4th night, the reflection took shape. Not a defined face, but a symmetrical movement, as if the glass were trying to imitate a human gesture. Amanda tested it. She tilted her head to the right, and the distortion in the glass seemed to follow suit with a half-second delay. She felt her heart race, not from direct fear, but from the feeling that she was being watched by something she was learning. She decided to change her strategy. Instead of simply recording, she began a ritual. She'd enter 312 at 3:11 a.m., adjust the pillow, and say, "Good night, Ruth," before stepping away. The sinking sound followed, and the reflex blinked in response. At the end of the first week, something new happened. The sheet sank not beside the patient, but onto the floor, at the side of the bed, as if someone very small were sitting there, resting their head against the mattress. Amanda knelt, pressed her knee against the cold floor, and felt the cold rise up through her skin like ice water. "It's okay," he whispered, as if speaking to a child waking from a nightmare. The portable recorder she'd left on the nightstand picked up a faint laugh, a laugh without joy, but with a hint of recognition. From that night on, the window stopped being just an accessory and began to act as a living mirror, reflecting not exactly what it saw, but what it wanted to show. 3 weeks of intense shifts, recording sessions, and sleepless nights began to take their toll. Amanda and Ezra debated whether to continue the experiments, while Louise spent most of her time silent, clearly more shaken than she cared to admit. The hospital management, pressured by rumors and declining productivity, determined that everything should return to normal. No recordings, no salt on the floor, no rituals with deceased patients' names. It was in this climate that Supervisor Harold Benton, a man with a deep voice, broad shoulders, and aggressive skepticism, entered the scene. He insisted that what was happening was pure psychological conditioning. Benton decided to conduct a personal test. At 3:05 a.m. that morning, he entered 312 with the room lights on full blast, opened the window to break the spell, and began speaking loudly into his pocket recorder. "There's no one here. There never was. This is a collective suggestion. You're all tired, and tiredness fills the void with stories." Amanda, standing in the doorway, crossed her arms. Ezra watched tensely from the hallway. At 3:12, as if obeying an invisible command, the sheet didn't dip. Benton smiled, satisfied. "See? Just be awake and don't expect anything." But his smile froze on his face when at 3:13 a.m. the room temperature dropped 4 degrees in less than 3 seconds. Benton felt a sudden shiver run down his spine. Before he could react, the pillow itself formed a deep circular indentation, as if someone had hurriedly rested their head there. The supervisor took 2 steps back, tripping over the IV stand's pedestal. The hollow sound of metal hitting the floor shattered the silence like a gunshot. Amanda, from the doorway, saw in his eyes something rarely seen in those who don't believe: pure fear. The sheet then sank completely, but this time it wasn't a delicate gesture. It was heavy, as if the entire mattress were being pressed down by an invisible body. And the next instant it returned to normal too quickly, leaving an almost physical absence in the air. Benton left the room without a word. That night left a different mark. The presence seemed to respond not only to attention, but also to denial, and when provoked, it did not hesitate to respond. The dawn of March 28th arrived heavily. Heavy rain pounded against the windows, and every clap of thunder seemed to come from underground. The hospital operated on unstable power, and the lights flickered at irregular intervals. Amanda asked to sleep in the on-call dormitory, but management ordered her to stay on rounds. Room 312 was empty that night. Amanda entered shortly before 3:10, sat in the chair next to the bed, and watched. In the hallway, the storm echoed like a distant drum. At 3:12, the sheet dipped, but not in the center. The mark was elongated, as if someone had been lying on their side, facing her. The temperature dropped precipitously. Amanda remained still. After a few seconds, she felt the air near her arm thicken. When she looked, she saw that the fabric of the sheet near her elbow was curved, exactly where a small hand would rest. She didn't flinch. "I'm here," he said, his voice low, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. The recorder picked up 3 breathy notes, as if someone were trying to speak but couldn't. The light flickered brighter, and for a second the room was plunged into total darkness. It was at that moment that Amanda felt, with a precision she couldn't imagine, the weight of a head resting on her shoulder. There was no human warmth, just a gentle chill that strangely didn't hurt. She remained still, and so did the presence. Only when the light returned did the weight lift and the sheet return to its original shape. But Amanda could have sworn that for a moment she heard the muffled sound of a child's voice saying, "Good night." Over the weeks, small reports began to accumulate, coming from places and people not even directly involved in the case. A janitor, for example, refused to enter the second floor after hearing 3 sharp knocks on the empty gurney he was pushing, as if someone was trying to play. A receptionist, during her late-night shift, found a perfect circle drawn with her finger in the dust on the hallway windowsill. A physical therapist reported seeing the sheet in room 208 rise about an inch, without wind or human movement, before slowly falling. 2 different patients, admitted on different dates, said the exact same thing upon waking. "Can I go up just a little bit?" Neither of them knew Ruth's story. There was also a story that wasn't officially reported. A woman who said she saw a barefoot girl with dark hair and a light-colored dress walking down the 3rd-floor hallway. She called out to her, but the child disappeared the moment the light flickered. It wasn't a fleeting figure or a blur. It was a defined figure, but one that seemed to lack a complete understanding of its own body, as if it were still learning to walk. These stories, though small, formed a disturbing mosaic. Isolated, they could be dismissed. Together they formed a persistent, delicate, and at the same time impossible to ignore presence. In the end, what remains is not the answer, it's the empty space between the questions. Why does the sheet always sink at 3:12, as if obeying a clock that doesn't belong to the physical world? Why does the window's reflection not show what's in front of it, but what seems to want to learn to be seen? Why is the most persistent sensation not of danger but of a request? Fragile, silent, repeated night after night, as if time itself had frozen in an instant of waiting. When we piece together all the records, from Harold's case in room 214 to the late nights in room 312, what we have is not a traditional haunting story. There are no slamming doors, distant screams, or furniture moving on its own. There is only a gesture, the sinking of the fabric, the light weight at the side, the mark that insists on lingering for seconds longer than it should. And in this gesture, there is something intimate, almost familiar, as if the hospital harbored not a hostile entity, but an echo of someone still seeking company. Can we call it a ghost? Perhaps. Can we call it memory? Possibly, but neither of these words explains why the present seems to learn. Over the weeks, it adjusted its gesture, varied its point of contact, moved closer to human warmth, tried to synchronize its breathing. And, like any learner, it responded to the responses it received. It retreated in the face of contempt. It advanced in the face of acceptance. This idea that the invisible can respond, can adapt, is perhaps the most disturbing element. Because if you respond, then you listen. And if you listen, then you retain. And if you retain, perhaps you're just waiting for the right moment to return not a gesture, but something more. On Amanda's last shift at 3:12, nothing happened. No drop in temperature, no sinking. The room remained static, almost dead, until dawn. But as she gathered her belongings, she noticed something. The pillow had a small, circular indentation, as if a light head had rested there overnight, unnoticed. Beside the indentation in the sheet was a long, almost imperceptible crease that ran from shoulder height to the edge of the bed. It didn't look like an ordinary crease. It looked like the footprint of someone lying on their side and slowly moving away. Amanda ran her hand over the fabric. It was still cold, and for the first time, she didn't try to call out his name. She just stood there, feeling the silence. The hospital returned to its routine. The corridors regained the sound of hurried footsteps, the clatter of metal carts, the smell of stale coffee. But for those who were there, the 3:12 clock never sounded the same again. It was a reminder that somewhere, perhaps in the very space between air and body, someone or something still sits nearby, waiting to be noticed. And if by chance you're lying in bed and feel the sheet give way, don't rush to turn on the light. Don't move immediately. Wait a second longer. Maybe it's just the weight of a memory. Or maybe, in that moment, on the other side of the fabric, someone is finally learning to be with you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.